Right, this is the dissertation podcast supplemental recording. What I'm going to try and do is be clever and integrate the video with the PowerPoint, which I've got up here so I can see it on the screen, just in case I'm not as clever as I would like to be, which is almost, let's face it, a given. If I can't get the two things to splice in together, then I'll upload the PowerPoint for you all to access, and when I'm changing screens I will tell you to camera I'm changing screens, so you can sit there with the PowerPoint up on your laptop and you'll know which screen I'm talking about in terms of which information. So going from the first screen to the second screen, in terms of what constitutes an ethics dissertation, I'll cover both the history and the law combinations for this, so that everyone gets a bit of everything, as both a reminder for those who were there for the first session a couple of weeks ago, and for those fresh approach for those who weren't there. The ethics dissertations should be basically a philosophical exploration of a moral issue that you are interested in, that you want to cover, which is either a moral issue for the historians amongst you that is centred in a period of history in the past. So, for example, James was talking about doing the Victorian freak shows and the sort of ethics of that as they were understood in Victorian times, but also as that's changed and kind of come up to date with 20th and now 21st century versions of the same concept. How do we understand freak shows? How do we understand things like the Jeremy Kyle show, which have an element of looking at strange people behaving bizarrely and laughing at them, and kind of that same point and gulp attitude that you used to get with the Victorian freak shows. So that's an example of a historical one, where you're taking a period of history and moving it forward into the present and contrasting philosophical theories as to why things were this way X many hundreds of years ago and how they are understood today. If you're thinking in terms of a law and ethics dissertation, then you're taking an example of law, and it's probably easiest if you stick to British law. You could potentially look at French, German, Italian, Chinese, Arabian or whatever law, but probably, I would guess, easier to stick to British law, in that you'll get lots of resources in a language you can definitely read about that, whereas some foreign law codes you might find almost all of it is written in some other language, and it's difficult to find English language information about the sources you will need. So you're taking a law and you're looking at the ethical backdrop to why that law is the way it is, and whether or not there is an argument for it to change in some way, to be updated, improved, not just improved in terms of the efficiency of how the law works, but whether there is a philosophical call for that law to be amended in some shape, form or capacity. So moving on to the third slide, which is the one about sample history and ethics topics. You've got there examples of ones such as slavery in the 17th century, why it was abolished, and what factors moved people to abolish it. So you would look at, if you were doing something like that, you would obviously explain what slavery was, you'd contextualise it in the 17th century, and then look at the philosophical reasonings people gave at the time, their writings, newspaper articles, that kind of sermons preached from pulpits, that sort of thing, in terms of how people justified the existence of slavery. And then you'd look at the factors that led to the abolition. So what changed people's minds? Was it particular books? Was it meeting escaped or freed slaves? Was it some preacher, some politician, some figure who stood up and changed people's thinking, and how that rippled out to more and more people thinking, no, this is wrong, we shouldn't do this, we should change the law, starting campaigns for it, and how that led to the ending of legalised slavery. We still have illegal slavery, obviously, but you're looking at the ending of legal slavery at that point. Another example you've got here is what factors led to a change in the public perception of the anatomist from Gaul to researcher. So again, historically you would contextualise what is an anatomist, why did anatomists exist, going back a few centuries, and medical research being hampered by the religious views and concerns about the destruction of the body and how that would impact on the day of judgment and the day of resurrection. But a body that's chopped into 1,000 pieces and put in jars cannot be resurrected in the same way as an intact body placed into the grave can be. You'd bring in maybe the concerns about legal issues there, in the Anatomy Acts, things like that, where condemned criminals were offered to the anatomists to dissect in universities on medical degrees and medical courses, and then you could move that forward a little bit further to think of more recent changes in law which enabled anatomists to claim bodies that nobody else wanted of the desperately poor who had died in workhouses and places like that, and again their bodies were cannibalized and used. At that point in history, a lot of people were terrified of anatomists, and they saw them as these sorts of mad scientists slicing up bodies, and it was all very ghoulish and horrible and there. So you could look at some historical documents on that. But then obviously these days we look at medical researchers as, you know, curing diseases, and they're these fantastic people who save us from terrible illnesses and injuries, and use their research to do wonderful things for humanity. So there's been this big shift, and you'd be looking at the ethical, the legal, the social, the various other factors that charted that shift. So where this is different from a straightforward history dissertation is in looking at not just events, who did what to who, when, where, why, but also looking at the reasoning, the philosophy, the thinking, what was going on in people's heads, what books were they reading, what sermons were they hearing in church, what were politicians saying in Parliament at the time. How has philosophy acted as a motivating force in social change, in the unfurling of historical events? There's a couple of others there, but I don't want to bore you to death with them all. So we'll go on to the next stream, which is the sample law and ethics topics. So, for example, we've got there the origins of child protection laws in the case of Mary Ellen McCormack, the human animal. That goes back to the case of the young American girl who was being horrendously abused by her adoptive mother, where the neighbours tried to intervene and they couldn't, so that they then abducted the child, took her to a place of safety. When it all hit the courts, they argued that the child had protection under animal laws about cruelty to animals, because the human being is an animal, and they argued that the laws about protecting dogs and cats and horses and so forth could extend to protecting humans, and it became this big scandal in the newspapers, where journalists said how awful it is that we have to use laws designed for the protection of dogs and horses to protect an innocent child from being battered senseless by this wicked adoptive mother. And so that eventually led to child protection laws being introduced in America and in Britain and in all sorts of other countries. So from a legal point of view, you do a little bit of historical background, you kind of set out what this case was, what the laws were involved, and why the neighbours cited the animal protection laws, how that led to an outrage, and it led to a reform in our understanding of the need for child protection laws. You could then bring in a lot of philosophical arguments that some people were very resistant to this, because they saw it as government interfering in private family life, and that if they wanted to smack their children, they should be allowed to smack their children, and the government shouldn't be interfering. And other people said, well, there's, smacking is one thing, but beating your child half to death is a whole other issue again, and that children need protection from wicked, cruel, excessively brutal parents. And like excessively brutal teachers and so on in schools back in the days when caning and so forth existed. So you'd be looking at those kinds of philosophical arguments and maybe bringing it up to date, comparing different modern countries' child protection laws. What is the philosophy underpinning these laws in different parts of the world? So you'd expand it around that. What else have we got here? So the ethical and legal dilemmas of consensual adult incest. That's a really rancid one. For that, you would look at the laws around incest, and the fact that in this country we only had laws about incest, against incest, in 1908. Before that, it had been seen as a rather dirty, unpleasant thing, but something which was best left to the vicar to go around and have stern words with families that were getting up to that kind of thing and tell them to stop. It wasn't seen as something that the law should get involved in, that government should get involved in, until 1908. So you could look at, again, a little bit of historical context. Why in 1908 was that law brought in? What had happened to inspire the bringing in of that law? How did people react? Did they agree with it? Did they oppose it? What was the first case brought to trial? How was it dealt with? Was the parent or whoever it may have been, uncle, grandfather, were they locked up? How did the newspapers react to that? The element you've got there, consensual adult, a lot of the 1908 laws and a lot of the subsequent updated laws about incest have assumed it's primarily tackling an adult molesting a child, which almost everyone would say is immoral and wicked and wrong for very, very obvious reasons. What happens if you've got, let's say, a brother and a sister in their 20s who are having sex with each other? So no one is being molested against their will. You could argue that they are psychologically disturbed and all those sorts of issues, but this is two adults who are consenting as opposed to a powerful adult molesting a vulnerable child. So is there an argument to be made against that? So you could look at the laws around incest between adults rather than just the parent-child dilemma. What are the ethical arguments as well as the legal arguments to be made against that? Why is it wrong? You could bring in issues about inbreeding. Okay, explore that. But of course not everyone who has sex has children. So supposing this couple of a brother and sister, or two brothers, two sisters, whatever combination, there is no child. Should it still be illegal? So you could bring in arguments around mental harm, emotional harm, psychological damage, all of those sorts of things. What's the evidence around that? What arguments can be made? So how is law created? How is the law then implemented in court? You can bring in all sorts of other ones. There's a bit here about resolving legal disputes between doctors and parents over children's medical needs. So you could cite cases like the Jehovah's Witness families, where the parents have said, no, we don't want blood transfusions, and the doctors have said, well, your child will die without a blood transfusion. Sometimes it's led to court cases where the lawmakers, the government, have overruled the rights of the parents to refuse medical treatment for their child and said, if the doctors say it is vital for life, then that blood transfusion or other procedure must be carried out whether the parents object or not. So again, similar as with the previous one, there's concerns people raise about the government interfering in family life, interfering in religious belief, and saying people cannot enact their religious beliefs, except it's not quite like that, because here it's saying you as an adult can refuse whatever you want to refuse, but when it comes to your child, you cannot refuse on behalf of your child. So the distinction between applying your religious belief to yourself and applying it to another vulnerable, in this case youngster, another young person who cannot make necessarily that choice for themselves. So you'd explore some of those legal ramifications and legal issues. On to the next screen, we're looking at qualitative research. What is qualitative research, you ask? It's research without too much number crunching involved. So it tends to be primarily interview based. So you could do an open-ended interview, you could do a structured interview where you got a set of, say, 10 questions, however many it is, and you ask the same 10 questions of each person you talk to. Whereas an open-ended one, you might have the same one or two questions to start with, but then you're just seeing what they say and then you're going with it and dreaming up questions on the spot based upon what they've said to you. The preference is being that if the issue you're exploring is quite a big one and you're not too sure what they might say, open-ended is better. If you're trying to keep the information manageable and you've got a rough idea of the kinds of things that person might say to you, then a closed interview where you've got a fixed number of questions will get you the very specific information you want. There's different arguments in favour of each according to the style of research you're doing. So essentially what you need to do is choose your research, and we will go over this in the second session. over the style of methodology. Choose the style of research you want, and obviously from a historical point of view or from a legal point of view, you might have particular methods that are favoured in history, particular methods that are favoured in law. But ethically, most of what goes on is either book-based research or interview-based research, essentially. So choose whatever style suits the topic you're researching, and that will depend on exactly what the topic is, so we can talk about that in class. On to the next screen, goes more detail about the styles and methods. So you've got various options here outlined. Ethnographic research, which is another word for field research, where you go out and you meet people in their place. So for example, if you were doing ethnographic research involving the medical question about doctors and parents and so forth, you could go to a hospital, you could talk to doctors, talk to nurses, potentially talk to patients, although that one's challenging, but talk to people where they are at. A bit harder to do that if you're doing the question on anatomists, admittedly, and field research can be more difficult from a historical point of view. But that's a slightly side issue. From a legal point of view, you could go and talk to people who are directly affected by the kinds of laws you're looking at, and talk to them in whatever place they're comfortable with. You do have to make sure you've got various rules around this within the university, and obviously your personal safety, so not going to the home of a complete stranger where you could be at risk once the door's locked. So you'd meet them in a public place or a place of work, something like that. We'll go over this more in the next session. But it's getting there a feel for what they believe, what they think, how they behave from them directly in a place that they're comfortable with. Critical social research, similar sort of thing, but you're more observational. So you're out with people, and it's not usually so much one-to-one. It's more commonly where you're with at least two people or a group, and you're observing them. What you're observing is how they communicate, mostly with each other rather than with you. So how do they talk to each other? Does one person in that group talk a lot more than other people talk? Do they talk in a particular way, use certain jargon terms, certain languages? Are they very gentle, very quiet, very shouty, very authoritarian or authoritative? You might be looking at issues of age or gender, something. Do the men talk more than the women, or vice versa? Do the older people hold sway and the younger people listen, or does everyone chip in equally? How does the conversation go? How do they communicate? What body language are they using? A lot of people use quite vivid imagery when they're talking, so what kind of images are they using to communicate with one another? So that's an observational one where you might be getting people's reactions and observing how they discuss and explore certain themes, certain issues. Historical research, obviously for the three historians amongst you, but also for the two law students, that a bit of that might be looking at the history of law, where the particular law you're looking at, when was it first brought in, who brought it in, why did they bring it in, so you're putting a bit of historical backdrop. So it's going around libraries, obviously not necessarily just the library here. You might need to go to a library attached to a museum or attached to the Law Society or attached to one of the big universities, something like that. Looking at all documents, trying to find information, trying to find sources that you can analyse. We'll discuss hermeneutics at the second session, but hermeneutics is the art of analysing documents and trying to get a sense for what people are saying, but also a sense for what they're keeping quiet about and what they're not talking about. So exploring those issues. On to the next screen. Grounded theory is a broad approach in which essentially you're looking at a subject where there is no particularly strong or good theory already, and you're trying to create a new theory about something that no previous person has thought very much about. Or if they have, they did it a very long time ago and not in a very good way. So you're coming in trying to build a theory from the ground up. It's quite ambitious, but it doesn't mean you can't consider it. And lastly on this screen we've got phenomenology, which is where you are coming at a subject in a very non-judgmental way, and you're trying to understand what this is like for the people who live this experience. So let's say you were looking at laws regarding domestic violence. what is it like to be a victim of domestic violence, or a perpetrator of domestic violence, or a barrister who handles a lot of domestic violence cases, or a police officer who gets called out to disputes. You're not trying to say who's right, who's wrong. You're just trying to get a real sense from their point of view what it is like to experience that thing, that subject, that issue. Or if you were doing something on, Ian mentioned the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder in soldiers. What's it like you talk to a soldier? What is it like to be in a war zone? What is it like to come home afterwards and live with all those horrible memories and flashbacks, and every time a car backfires you have a sudden massive panic and feel as if you're back on the field of battle. Hazel was talking about studying teachers, so you talk to teachers, talk to students. What is it like to be a teacher? So it's not saying who's a good teacher, who's a bad teacher, what's the best method of teaching or anything like that. It's just saying what's it really like to be this kind of a person. So you sit down with somebody who is that kind of person, and you let them talk, open-ended interview. And what you're really trying to do is get inside their head as much as you reasonably can to see what its life is like from their point of view, why they think what they think, why they do what they do. And then you're just presenting it without any judgment as to whether they are right or wrong. Just this is them. It's a challenging one, but it's interesting. Next screen gives you various different styles of approach, some of which we've mentioned, the observation, for example. Field notes is when you've done an observation and you rush home and you very quickly write up your notes about it, and there's various kind of guidelines as to the fact that it's got to be done quickly. The longer you leave it, the more you'll forget, obvious stuff like that. And the kind of things you need to take notes about, the kind of issues you need to jot down, all that sort of stuff. Reflexive journals is where you keep a diary and you record not just the people it's not about the people you're interviewing, it's about your own thoughts. You've got home at the end of the day from interviewing someone, do you sit there and think, what a lovely person? Or do you think, what a weirdo? Or what do you think about them? How do you react to what you've done? And so you're recording your own ideas and then using elements of it in the dissertation. The interviews we've already mentioned, and the document analysis we'll go over more next time anyway. That's the hermeneutics bit, where you're looking at newspapers, old books, sermons, political speeches, letters that soldiers might have sent home from the battlefield to their parents or their wife, husband, whoever. Any kind of document, something that somebody has written, and you're trying to understand the context of it and analyse it. So we'll leave that one a bit more for next time. Participant observation, slightly more detail. On the next screen you've got the little picture there of the animal rights march protest. So participant observation is where you join in something to get a sense of what it's like being in that group of people. Some groups of people, clearly the university would be very, very uncomfortable with you joining in on. So if you got the urge to go and write a dissertation about very far-right extremists, then clearly the university is not going to be happy with you going along on some BNP Ku Klux Klan rally or something like that, because it's putting you at risk. So participant observation has to be with people who are not going to hurt you. And essentially you try to become part of the group, you join in, you find out what it's like to be in that group, and you write about it afterwards. So you're getting alongside people, essentially, is what that boils down to. The non-participant observation is which is the next screen, where you stand in a corner and you watch a group of people getting up to whatever they're getting up to, and you take notes. They know you're there, usually. That's an ethical issue in itself if you're hiding behind shrubbery. But normally they know you're there, and the hope is eventually they'll get used to the fact that you're there and they'll stop paying attention to you and they'll start acting normally, and you just take your notes down. You can be very technologically clever and set up a camera to observe people for that. That's something we can talk about later. The screen mentions the Hawthorne effect. That is simply the idea that when you're observing people, they will be uncomfortable. They'll know you're there, they can see you with your clipboard, and they may not relax enough to act naturally. They may be acting in a very weird sort of a way because they know you're there. So they might be extra polite, or in some cases, if it's teenagers, extra rude, because they know you're in the corner. And that you have to factor in, the fact that you may not be seeing people in a natural state, because they know they're being observed. That has issues in itself, but we can go around that later. Next screen is about field notes, but we've already mentioned those. You'll see here a quote from Emerson, and that's just partly a helpful prompt that when you're writing your methodology for the dissertation, you'll have to have a section where you justify your choice of method. So whether you're doing interviews or hermeneutics or field research or this or that or the other, where you have to say, why am I doing this? And you've got to give a nice reason. You can't just say I'm doing this because it was the least amount of effort. You've got to say something that sounds good. You will need to mention a researcher who has recommended that method, at least one, and highlight any strengths of the method you're using, what's good about it, and highlight any weaknesses, problems, like the Hawthorne effect, for example, and what you have done to try to counteract the problems that are inherent to that style of research. Again, we'll come back to this more in class. Reflexive journals on the next screen we've already mentioned, so we'll skip that over. The screen after that, you've got an outline of what's involved in structured interviews, but we've already mentioned that a little bit, so we can go over that in the next class if you want more details on that. But it's just the general idea. You know what questions you're going to ask. Some of the questions may be yes/no ones. Some of them may be multiple choice. You tick A, B, C, or D. Some of them may be questions to which they could give longer answers, but it's a fixed question, and essentially if you interview 10 people, all 10 of them get the same question. That's the way it works in a structured interview. So it's standardizing. An unstructured one on the next screen, we've mentioned again, that's just to reiterate, where you are expecting fairly long answers, and you don't know really what those answers are going to be, so saying A, B, C, or D isn't very helpful. So you might go along and say, well, tell me about your experience of post-traumatic stress disorder, or your experience of standing in front of a classroom full of teenagers and teaching them, whatever it may be. And that person you're interviewing, whether they they answer the question in 30 seconds or 30 minutes, you just go with the flow. The problem there is, of course, they might take ages to answer questions, and you might be watching the clock and thinking, I need to get my bus or train or whatever. So you do need, even within an unstructured one, you need a little bit of structure to say, look, we've got half an hour, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and when the half hour is up we'll have to finish. Otherwise you're going to, it becomes unmanageable. So there's a tiny bit of structure, but mostly it's just letting that person talk about whatever they want to talk about. Obviously, if you do get one of those individuals who's a bit moody and surly and just grunts at you, then that is very difficult to have an unstructured interview. If they're just not really saying anything very useful to you, you get 1 or 2 word answers. Works better with people who are chatty. You've got to be careful on the next screen about sensitive issues, and a lot of the subjects people have suggested as possibilities are sensitive issues. People can get upset, they can get distressed by questions. Obviously you have to use your own common sense as to what counts as a sensitive issue, what will upset someone, what won't, and think about how you're going to ask questions and what you'll do. Have a strategy. What will you do if that person you're talking to gets upset? Because when you fill in the ethics form, you'll have to say, should the people I'm interviewing get upset, I will recommend them to go and talk to a counsellor, to phone this charity advice line, do this, do that, do the other. You'll have to have a demonstration that you have thought about what to do, and you won't be just caught on the hoof with that one. The documentary analysis, I say we'll talk about next time, that's on the next screen, so we'll leave that to the second time we meet up, but it's just looking at the issues. Part of all of this, both the interviews and the documentary stuff, is the question of validity, which is the next screen. How do you know that the people you're talking to are worth talking to? If you are using a particular pile of books or whatever, how do you know those books are worth looking at? You've got to offer a justification for why these resources, human or otherwise, are the right resources, why they are worth using. That need only be a paragraph or two to justify your choices. But again, we'll come back to that as we go along. Focus groups are a possibility on the next screen. I wouldn't recommend them, but they are a possibility, where you get a bunch of people, 10 people, however many people, in a room to chat about an issue, and you sit quietly in a corner and observe how the conversation goes. The difficulty there, of course, is getting 10 people in a room at the same time, talking about whatever it is that you want them to talk about. You can use rooms in the college for that, that's fine. The next screen is about role-play methods and case studies, but in all honesty, they're more aggro than they're worth, so I wouldn't recommend them. Screen after that, you've got the layout, things like cover page, dedication page, and so on, with approximate guidelines on the numbers of the rough amount of words to have on each screen. There is a handout to go with that. Some of you have had the handout already. I think some of you might still be waiting for it, but you can collect it from me in class. And if you've got any questions about that, we can talk about that and go from there. So start off with your broad subject area, the rough thing you want to talk about, and then, as per the next screen, you've got to winnow it down to a question which by the end of your dissertation, by the final paragraph, you can give an answer to. So why did this law change? How could this law be replaced with a better law? Why did this event in history happen the way it did? Who were the big thinkers that affected it? Those kinds of things. So it becomes answerable, something you can address. That's something we can work on in the next session when we're sort of tightening up, polishing up the areas that we're looking at. And we'll also go over the ethics form, which is quite a big piece of work in itself. You have to fill it in and get it approved before you can go ahead and start doing your research. And talk about sampling, which if you intend to interview people, then the question becomes, how do you find those people? That's what sampling is about, where you get people from in order to talk to them. But we'll deal with that in the next session. And so, if we end that one here, I'll upload this and